Welcome to Lab 9, Pedology. This video has been provided for you as a source for step-by-step, page-by-page instructions in which I'll provide some additional tips, tricks, and hints on how to complete this lab effectively and efficiently. I also find this is very helpful, especially if you're in a face-to-face class, to come back and reference and hear the instructions again, but especially if you're in an online course or a hybrid where you can go back and revisit things as you get closer towards your exams, because perhaps you forget how to do one part. You can reference these videos for that. Now we can see for this lab the learning objectives are to learn to describe the physical and chemical properties of soil. We'll also learn to compare the 12 soil orders found in the United States. We'll also use Geographical Information Systems, GIS, to analyze soils. We'll learn to identify soils and their methods and to analyze soil contamination using Environmental Justice, GIS. That being said, let's start Lab 9. So before we start with Part A, I think it's important to mention something very important when discussing soils, and that's going to be the carbon cycle. We know how important soils are. This goes through that context, but I think something that's important to mention is that soils are important components of the biogeochemical cycles. For example, as part of the carbon cycle, soils hold 3 times more carbon than plants do or any other living organism. So we'll begin to speak a little bit more about just that idea of carbon, input, exput, because we know that the oceans are able to absorb and retain some of that excess carbon. Plants will, take away some of that. And we're talking about the carbon footprint that's being left behind, not just through nature, but through humans. And so where does it go? Where's that balance and that push and pull systems within that? And so we can observe that in this diagram, which brings us into the idea that soils are very different than dirt. When we think about natural resources, most of us think of air and water, but soil is quite neglected, even though it is mostly interconnected with everything, including our health and just the atmosphere. So dirt is the stuff you get in your shoes, and that's the stuff that's not what we're really looking at. We're looking at the actual soil itself, the material underneath the surface. So just know there's a big difference there. Now Part A introduces the soil properties. Soils are composed of mineral matter from weathered parent material, organic material, water, and air. Soil properties are the physical and chemical characteristics of soil, which in most cases are direct results of weathering. So the first thing that we can observe here is figure 19.2, which is the soil formation. If you'd like some additional information, there is a video on this later. I'll talk about that. But what are the horizons? What are the layers? So once we get past the stuff on the top, if we were to dig down very deep beneath the surface, we would see that there are some layering, that there are actual layers that separate. So maybe you've dug a hole in the backyard before and you're digging down, and the top part's usually really brown and stinky, and then you kind of get down and it gets more compacted, and then you get farther down and also you get large random rocks, and then you finally hit bedrock. Well, there's a story in place there, and that's what can be observed here. And now instead of just calling them layers, we actually can denote and give them a letter that has a representation of what they value as. So question 1 says, referring to that figure above, 19.2, list the major changes that you notice from the soil column on the far left to what is observed on the far right. Now that's just based off your observations and interpretations. Now once you complete that, now we're going to give those letters, those different horizons of a meaning or a value. O represents organics. A represents the partially decayed organics, otherwise known as topsoil. E represents an eluviated or transferred zone. B represents a layer that has been accumulated with clay, otherwise known as the subsoil. C is a layer of incomplete weathering and large rocks, but mixture of soil. And then R is the bedrock or parent material. So that being said, going back to question 2, it says, based on the descriptions provided above, label the horizons shown on each of the 4 soil diagrams. So what we're going to be able to see here is, here we are. Table 19.1. So these are 4 random soil profiles, and it's having you learn to identify those different layers. So it says here as an example for soil profile number 1, few horizons have formed because the parent material was recently exposed to weathering. There is some biological activity initiated by moss growth on the top. So you can see the little lines. Each line is a specific letter that you would find from, as I grow up, one of these. So based on our understanding, our representation, and then, again, use this table as reference. This is over time of a traditional soil horizon. So as you can see, not all layers have one of each present. That being said, I do have a video shared here in the description where I go through the development of soils and go in a little more depth of what those horizons are. So anyway, you do that for soil profile 1, soil profile 2, 3, and 4. You're going to work through all four of those by identifying what layers are present. So then question 3 says, now apply what you've learned. List the impacts of the extraction of bauxite from tropical regions has on local environments and population. And you can find that information for your observation and interpretation based on the tables that you just filled in, as well as the blurb on the previous page. Now, another physical property of soil is going to be its color. Now, when we looked at minerals, we will know that the color isn't necessarily the most important when trying to identify the specific type of mineral that it is, because we'll learn that certain minerals can come in a different array of colors. But it's actually quite helpful when looking at soils because due to weathering, both chemical and physical weathering, certain minerals will turn a specific color, which will be observed in soils. So as we can see on this table here, 19.2, we can see a handful of different minerals within the material, as well as the formula and the common soil color. And this is important for us to understand, these different minerals, because then it kind of gives you an idea as to what is present. So kind of going back to question 3, thinking about just the impacts of extraction of minerals from different soils. Well, this is an identifier as to what minerals might be present in a certain soil. It also lets you know how the soil might work later, as we'll talk about, when it comes to drainage and also for growability for agriculture. So question 4 says, now refer to that table that we just talked about, the different colors. What colors are commonly seen when iron is present? Also, part B is what color is commonly seen when calcium is present? So you'll be able to pull that from that table above. Another attribute that we look at when it comes to soil will be its texture. And this is a little more complicated, but it's actually quite interesting in the sense that we learn to identify soil also based on its texture. And when I say that, it's because I think probably for most of my life, I thought sand, as an example, represented a particular type of material. Beach sand is just sand, that's what it is. But what it comes to be is that these names denote a grain size. So sand, it doesn't matter what it's made out of, it's a specific grain size. So is silt and so is clay. So it says down here, soil texture refers to the size of the mineral itself in the soil. All soils can be classified by the amount of sand, silt, or clay that might be present. So this little diagram here, figure 19.4, gives you, in relation, the size differences between them. So, sand, what beach sand looks like, and silt is very small, particles, but clay is incredibly fine. We're going to learn now to apply that information into some form of activity. There is a guided practice video here. You can take a picture of that QR code or hit that hyperlink. It takes you to a 2.5-minute video explaining how to use a soil texture triangle. Also, I have shared within the description a video that I did as well in case you need some additional support. So this is your soil texture triangle, and it looks kind of complicated, but it's quite simple. So what we do is, in the field, we'll collect samples of soil, and then what we'll do is we'll burn off all the organic stuff. We don't want any of that. We want literally just the material left behind. And then we're going to give it a percentage. We find that everything must add up to 100%. So we'll look at those samples and go, well, perhaps this particular sample we have, sample A, might be 10% silt, 80% sand, and 10% clay. So it has these percentages, which is helpful, but we want to give it a name. We want to be able to write about this in a report. We want to talk about the, maybe the color, and maybe we want to talk about what minerals are involved, but I also want to say that this soil has a special name based on its grain size distribution. So you'll be able to plot them. The video explains better because I don't have a drawing device that I'm using right now, but you can see my mouse. Clay goes from 0 to 100%, and those lines are drawn horizontally. So if it's 60% clay, it would be drawn across this line. You'll go the same direction in which the numbers are. Silt goes from 0 to 100%, and the lines are drawn at the same angle. So if it's 30% silt, it would have been drawn on this line going all the way down. And last would be sand, 0 to 100%. Maybe it's 50%. You see it's drawn there. Now, the reason these percentages must equate to 100 is that all three of your lines will intersect and cross each other. And when it intersects in a specific box, like this is a box of clay, this is a box of loam, this is a box of silt, then that is the name that you would give to your sample. So you will go ahead and solve these examples here. And it says each of the three soil textures have been characterized in table 19.3. Summarize their properties. So here we have, again, some properties, the amount of sand, the amount of silt, and the amount of clay, and it gives you the properties. So as an example, a soil with fertility will have the ability to sustain plant growth. It must have low sand, moderate to high silt, and moderate to high clay. And so based on that, you're going to be able to answer these questions. Question 6, loam is the ideal soil texture for most vegetable crops. From figure 19.5, determine the relative amounts of silt, sand, and clay for a loam soil, and use table 19.3, this table here, to describe the characteristics that you would expect to find in a loam soil. So what you'd do is you'd go back here, and you would pick, I usually pick a spot that's easy, like that intersects, and go, okay, well that is loam. So what percentages do I get within that? And then so you're kind of doing it in reverse in a sense. And then you'll be able to take those percentages and relate it to this table here to be able to answer question 6. Now, another piece of just understanding soils will be its structure. So another physical property is called soil structure. Soil structure is the way in which the components of a soil aggregate or collect together. There are several common structures called PEDs, and soil PEDs influence how water will permeate through a soil. So what that means is, depending on the structure itself of the soil, will really control the rate in which water that sits on top is able to transfer through. So that you can see that it can be examples: granular, lenticular, platy, wedge, prismatic, massive, or single grain. This is an important piece when studying soil. I think a great example of this would be to also look at its permeability and porosity, which we'll talk about later. But I always think of those areas on grass, like in parks, where people constantly walk and they compact the soil to the point that nothing will grow there. So it creates like a trail. Well, you're changing its soil structure by compaction, and then depending on its its design and its grain size will also affect how that works. So question 7 says, referring to figure 19.6, answer these questions. Apply what you've learned. Which soil structures would have the highest levels of permeability, or meaning that water has a better rate of transferring through? Part B, apply what you've learned. What soil structure do you think would have a low level of permeability, or meaning that it will not be permeable? It will not allow water to transfer effectively. Another piece of understanding chemicals of soils and their properties would be their chemical property. So we have this here. It's called cation exchange capacity. So cations are positively charged ions such as aluminum, calcium, hydrogen, magnesium, sodium, and negatively charged particles such as clays and organic material attract positively charged cations through electrostatic forces. A soil's CEC will represent the total amount of exchangeable cations that it can absorb. So you're going to work through some of this, again, working through your critical thinking skills. Review the 4 physical properties of soils: the horizon, the color, the texture, and structure. Which characteristics of those physical properties would you expect to increase the CEC of a soil, or that cation exchange capacity? Explain your response in 1 to 2 sentences. That being said, we can look at its pH level. pH is a measure of the hydrogen ions in a substance. pH is a logarithmic scale. Acids go from 0 to 6.9, 7 is neutral, and then 8 to 14 are going to be alkaline. So a pH of 3 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 4, so on and so forth. So question 9 says, based on pH, using your critical thinking skills, based on what you know about cation exchange, what are soils with higher levels of clay and organic matter less likely to have fluctuations in pH levels when compared to sandy soils? So why would they be different than sandy soils? And explain your answer. And so as you work through, there's lots, I'm kind of pushing through this. There's lots of those resources within here that I'm just kind of passing through. So make sure you're reading through this to get those bigger informations. Again, if you kind of get confused with CECs and cations, Google it. And that's what this is about, is looking out and reaching into those resources that are available to you. So that being said, let's review the physical and chemical properties of soil. Complete table 19.4 in your own words by briefly summarizing the 4 physical properties and the 2 chemical properties of soil. So you're going to write down, again, physical or chemical property, what is the name of the property, and the property description itself. Question 11 says to list the variables that greatly influence the physical and chemical properties of soil. Now that you've kind of got a little bit understanding of all the different physical and chemical features that are observed in soil, let's look at our local soil properties. So for this section of the lab, you will use the California Soil Resource Lab Soil Properties, GIS, from the University of California, Davis. So the first step is to take a picture of that QR code or to click that hyperlink, in which you'll then get a tutorial video on how to use this website. Once you feel comfortable, now you go to step 1, you take a photo of the QR code, hit the hyperlink, and it's going to work you through step by step on how to collect specific data based on either your location or a location that was designated by your instructor, and then you'll begin to start working through that. So question 12 says, once you've collected all that, describe the location that you have selected to investigate. For example, maybe this is the intersection of Interstate 5 and the Sacramento River. You get to pick your location. Then slide the transparency bar to the left so you can see the percentage of sand found at your location. What is the range of sand found there? Then you move through step 8. Repeat the same steps. Now do silt and clay. And then step 9, click on Avail Water Holding Capacity. Then click on the question mark icon and read the information about that variable. Then step 10, it says on the left-hand sidebar, click on the soil color, then click on the question mark to read more about that attribute and the colors that are available. Step 11, click on the soil color 10 centimeter and the soil color at 25 centimeter and the one at 75 and also the one at 125. And once you do that, you're going to be able to describe how do the soil colors change from depth, from the surface going downward. Now that you've looked at color, you're going to move on to step 12. We're going to look at the chemical properties, and that's going to wrap you up through questions 21 through 24. So what you're doing here is you're using the data found at UC Davis, and you're looking at a specific location. You're going to describe that location, and you're going to start looking at both the physical and the chemical properties of that sampling that you have selected. Did you know, fun fact, that all states have a state soil? So if you're doing this lab elsewhere, it may be in a different state, you got to look up what your state soil would be. Now, the last question here, question 25, says, by using your critical thinking skills, why do you think or what do you think explains the spatial variability of pH on the map that you've observed? Why do you see such variability between the left and the right on your pH scale? And be sure to describe your response. That being said, we wrap up part A. So part B is called soil orders. In the United States, soils are classified into 12 categories known as soil orders. This is done so by looking at both the physical and the chemical characteristics of each type of soil. Each soil itself can be subdivided into subcategories, just like you would with anything else. When we talk about climate has major categories, but then there are subcategories within that. Now, before we review the key characteristics of each soil, let's just analyze the global soil region map, which can be observed here, figure 19.7. So we can see all these different names. You got antisols, you've got oxysols, ice, glaciers, rocky land. So we have all these different soil names, and I think what's interesting when looking at stuff like this, especially if it's not something that you're quite familiar with, is when you learn to make those observations and interpretations. The map that we're seeing here is just denoting the locations of each of these soils. It's not showing topography, it's not showing any types of elevation or landscapes. It's just showing the location of each of these soils. But can you observe some of that topography? Can you observe the landscapes? And does it kind of make sense, based on what we're seeing? I mean, maybe the soils don't mean anything to you yet, the names, but do you see any patterns? Does this look like another map that maybe you've seen in another lab? And, as an example, a weather map. And you will find that there will be correlations with that as well. So question 26 says to refer to that figure 19.7, which two soil orders seem to be the most common along the equator, which two are most common near the world's deserts, and lastly, what soil order is most common at the highest latitudes of the northern hemisphere. Now let's start breaking into those descriptors. So if you take a photo of this QR code, or click the button, it'll take you to photographs of all the different soil orders that have been presented to us by the University of Idaho. So what's going to happen for the remaining part of this activity is it's going to take you each type of soil at a time. It's going to give you the name, and you're going to work through what those names mean, and then you're going to relate that to table 19.1. So it says, returning to question 2 at the beginning of this lab, which of these 4 soil profiles do you think would best represent one of these types of soils? So you're going to be working back and forth on these activities. So you have endosols, and then you move on into the next page, looking at oxysols, andosols, alphasols. So you're working through all these different types of soils. And I think that this is, I can't speak for all courses. I would never expect my students to memorize all of these soils, but I would expect them to be able to understand and to itemize the importance of each one and be able to reference back to it to understand, these are the type of soils you'll end up finding specifically in areas such as rainforests, or these are the type of soils that you'd find in deserts, or these are the type of soils you'd find when it's predominantly granite and maybe you're dealing with really high mountain ranges and stuff like that. So how do you kind of organize the main style and then subcategories? We did very much like this when looking at climate. How can we work through these activities to be able to identify the specific climate categorization of a location, including its major climate group, as well as the precipitation and temperature average values? So you'll be able to work through these, which will get you through to the last one, which is histosols and vertisols. Peat moss is a partially decayed organic material. What sort soil order would you expect to find peat in, and stuff like that. So I don't want to spend too much time going through each one of these because it really has you go back and forth throughout the lab, working on not just reading the observations and interpretations of these types of soils, but then you're going to be taking the information and trying to identify based on those soil profiles from earlier in the lab to match everything up to create really this seamless comparison between them. That being said, that wraps up part B. So part C is kind of like a really big putting it together. It's called soil order exploration. So now that you have clearly created your lists of all the different types of soils that are found throughout the world, and you've been able to match them with soil horizons to the best of your ability, let's apply that and do a little bit of research. So it says for this portion of the lab, we're going to be utilizing the California Soil Resource Lab GIS system. It's different than the one that we used before. It's a little, and as you'll see, it's a little different. So this one here, if you would like additional step-by-step help with that, you can scan that QR code. Otherwise, you can hit the hyperlink here and it'll take you to a 2-minute video that really walks you through how to navigate through this different website. Once you feel prepared, you go ahead and click this URL or scan the QR code, read the information, click OK, work through. And then step 4 is really the exciting part. It says, think about the 12 soil orders that you have learned about in this section. Select one of those soil orders and zoom in on a location where you think that you should find that type of soil itself. So essentially what it's asking is pick the one that you like the most, that you learned about, and then looking at, as you zoom out to look at the U.S., including Alaska and Hawaii, pick somewhere in the U.S. that you think that type of soil will be found. And then you'll work through these steps to see, what type of soil is found. And then you get down to this last part where it's asking you, essentially, were you right? And if not, that's okay. If not, why? What soil was found there? What soil did you think would be there? And what are the big differences? Whether it's based on chemical composition, maybe it's based on its latitude, maybe it's based on soil textures. Like what makes those different, and how close were you to that guesstimation? So again, this is really just kind of applying all the information that you put together in part B in your tables and charts, matching it up, and now you're going to see, okay, well, based on this known information, I'll pick deserts. Maybe there's a special type of soil that's found in deserts. Find the desert, and is that what you expect to find there? Were you right with your observation and interpretation? That being said, we wrapped up part C. So part D is the final portion of this lab, and it's looking at soil conservation and contamination. So really looking at the social and environmental impacts of soil, both natural and human-made. Now, soil conservation refers to the practice of maintaining healthy soils. In many regions, it takes hundreds of years to just form 1 inch of proper topsoil. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service works to use current scientific techniques to analyze and manage soils. Why is that important? Because if you overproduce, overuse, or disrespect the soil itself based on its composition or what minerals would be available or within trade of growing something, you can create essentially exactly what happened back in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. Most people think that the Dust Bowl in the Great Depression was something that was only environmental, that was a natural thing, and the reality is it was human induced. We were overproducing agriculture and not replenishing the soil with proper nutrients. Everything you grow takes some nutrients out and puts different nutrients back. So if you continue to grow, oranges year after year after year after year, at some point the soil will not be able to produce fruit. It will not be able to produce the nutrients that are needed to produce what you want. So that's when we step in and think about how do we rotate our crops, how do we balance. There's lots of really interesting research. If this is new to you, most of us have thought about just greenhouse gases and the emittance of greenhouse gases as being human induced. And we're finding that so many different types of greenhouse gases are being emitted specifically based off of fertilizers. Man-made fertilizers. The University of Florida is really leading the way on that type of research and trying to understand how can we naturalize our fertilizers and our systems and to create our soils, make them healthy without having to create additional, nitrogen and hydrogen and greenhouse gases that are being released. Methane in specific is the big one, by finding natural and better ways to do it than using chemicals as some form of fertilizer. But nonetheless, I digress. I apologize. So as we work through this is figure 19.8, which is through the USDA, which shows the nutrients and water quality. This is really important because, again, I'm going to go back to Florida as an example. Florida relies mostly on their fresh water from underground aquifers or areas in which water is stored underground. But by utilizing fertilizers, those fertilizers will rain off, or get washed off the soil or the plant, and will seep down into the aquifer, which essentially contaminates the water, which contaminates their drinking water. And we see this all across the globe, not just Florida. I'm just using it as an example because I just mentioned that. So, that's something that's very interesting. And so read through this diagram because it will really help you work through the remaining part of this lab. Question 46 says, in 1 or 2 sentences, explain how soils are connected to the other components of our biosphere. Then, the remaining part of this page is talking about the different types of soil contamination, looking at locations and places and what can occur in order for soil contamination to happen. Also, when you're learning about that, you can think about what can be done differently to avoid from that contamination from occurring. So as you learn more about what causes soil contamination and list the effects of soil contamination, that brings us into environmental justice, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of who you are, what walk of life, or where you're going. And it really talks about those and the laws that are in place to protect those people. The goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the following: the same degree of protection when it comes from environmental and health hazards, equal access to decision-making processes to have a healthy environment, to have clean drinking water, and to have natural resources available to you. So we're going to use this Cal Enviro screen. It's a mapping tool that has been able to identify California communities that are most affected by many sources of pollution and where people are often especially vulnerable to those pollutant effects. So it gives some examples, things such as drinking water, pesticide use, particulates in the air, cleanup sites, hazardous waste. Looking at all these different attributes. Then you're able to correlate it with sensitive populations that are more likely to have cancer, asthma, cardiovascular diseases. So you're able to look at all of these different attributes and see if there's a relationship. So you'll scan the QR code, go to the website, and you'll work through this using some of those tools that you have now learned about contaminants and what types can be there and how it affects people. So once you've done that, you're going to be able to explore this. Let's explore it to analyze soil contamination in California through an environmental justice framework, meaning that let's say you're working for someone, you're going to try to find some information. Note that the data is provided by a census tract, which means that the spatial scale is about 4,000 people. So you're going to click here, go to the website, zoom in on a location on the map that was either provided to you in the lab or designated from your instructor, and you'll start working through these steps, looking at how many people live there, what were they affected by, what type of contaminants are local and within that region. And you're going to start looking at these patterns. Look at the population census tract. How many people are living there again? What is the characteristics of that? Is there low fertility? Is it an elderly group? What are the different steps and rules? As you continue to work through that, you'll look at step 3, which has you close that window and zoom out so you can see the entire state of California. And now you're going to be able to observe the entire state using, essentially the legend and what you observe. Which region of the state has the higher percentiles? Using your critical thinking skills, what factors do you think contribute to those higher scores in these regions? Explain why. Then the last part here is to check out more. Maybe you are interested in environmental justice when it comes to essentially equitable rights of just clean water, clean soil, and just clean environments. So you're able to click here to learn more about the United States Environmental Protection Agency's website regarding to environmental justice. This itself is a career on its own, so if this interests you, you should certainly check out a little bit more as to what can be learned. Again, I hope that was helpful. I know that we kind of jumped through it a little bit, but that's because there are some additional of those guided practice videos. I shared some videos as well in the description of this video I posted here. If you have any questions or you found something interesting about your location, please comment below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next lab.